Good morning, welcome, good afternoon. I'm Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. As you can hear in my background, we are now at the turn of the hour. So thank you to our guests and all of our listeners and viewers for joining us for a program that we have entitled Top of Mind, Palestinian Analysts on Unfolding Scenes of Protest and Devastation. I am so glad and grateful to be joined today by Ines Abdel Razek, Zaha Hassan, and Nadia Hijab. I will introduce our guests fully in a moment, but I want to begin with some housekeeping. First, the format for today's event will be a discussion between the panelists and me. We will go for about an hour. This session is being recorded and it's being live streamed on Facebook. In addition to my questions, I am eager to take your questions. So please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window at any time. And please know that FMEP will share your questions with the panelists after this event. So if we don't get to them today, our panelists will still see them and they'll know what this audience is interested in hearing. Please don't use the chat box for your questions because I won't see them. As I said, we're recording this webinar. It will be available on the FMEP website later today and also as a podcast. And we will email the recording to everyone who has registered for the event. And finally, we are enabling the closed caption function event for those who prefer or need to read rather than to hear the discussion. If you have any trouble with closed captioning, please write a question about it into the Q&A. And now we'll begin. Today's event is entitled Top of Mind, Palestinian Analysts on Unfolding Scenes of Protest and Devastation. As many of you know, we had originally planned to have a discussion today about the exciting new report that Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, just published. And Zaha, Nadia, and Ines were going to join us for this discussion. They co-authored the report along with a scholar named Mona Yunus. As you also know, events have overtaken us. And so instead, we are lucky that Nadia, Ines, and Zaha are joining us today to talk about what is happening now in Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, Israel, and to reflect on how the events of the last few weeks speak to the larger story of Palestinian dispossession, Israeli domination, and the international community's approach to Palestine and Israel. Before we dive in, I want to give a fuller introduction for our guests. Their full bios are available on our website, but so that you know, these wonderful guests we're joined by today. Ines Abdel Razek, Advocacy Director for the Palestine Institute of Public Diplomacy, PIPD. Prior to joining the PIPD, Ines held advisory positions in the executive offices of the Union for the Mediterranean in Barcelona, the UN Environment Program in Nairobi, and the Palestinian Prime Minister's Office in Ramallah. Zaha Hassan, a human rights lawyer and visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Zaha's research focus is on Palestine-Israel peace, the use of international legal mechanisms by political movements, and US foreign policy in the region. Zaha miraculously published a paper today called Bringing Assistance to Israel in Line with Rights and US Laws. We're going to put a link, offer you the link. Nadia Hijab, co-founder, board president, and former executive director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Nadia is co-founder and former co-chair of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and now serves on its advisory board. We have so much to discuss, so I'm going to pose questions to individuals, but I welcome and invite each of you to respond to any question you wish, please. Ines, let's start with you. You're joining us from Jerusalem, and you've spent time in Sheikh Jarrah over these past few weeks. Would you like to give us an update from the ground, particularly on the situation in Jerusalem and in Gaza? What have the last 24 to 48 hours been like for you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for FMEP for having us. It is, you know, I'm among the privileged. I have a safe house where I can stay. I'm not threatened of eviction, and I live, I think, a bit, away from the heart of the violence by the Israeli forces. But it's, I think we're all very stressed and very angry, and also sad at the same time. All these feelings are, I think, intertwined. And what's going on is basically I would say, every night now around iftar and after, there are clearly, there is Palestinian protesters, young people who are facing a heavy armed, police that is in different areas of the city. So it's not, it's not concentrated in Sheikh Jarrah. It's not concentrated anymore into Al-Aqsa, but it does spread to also other Palestinian areas, around there, like Salahuddin, and basically that whole area of East Jerusalem. And it's clear that, I mean, what I've seen, and what we know is clearly that the police is just there to repress any form of mass gathering or forms of popular resistance or group resistance. And so that means they don't hesitate to just storm into a crowd with rubber bullets, with stun grenades, and with also skunk water. I left the other day, I had to take almost like 2 showers, and imagine for the people who lived there. And so it's bad. I think the level of violence is clearly, it's just shocking. But it's not like people are surprised, because Palestinians, they live under a lower intensity level of violence, I think, every day. And I think people have been really amazed to see also the support from the West Bank and cities in 1948, within Israel proper, like Palestinian cities, and Gaza as well. Like, I think even you can see messages of solidarity, even that Gaza is suffering so much. So you can see also the dialogue happening between the people who cannot even meet and be with each other. So I think that's also the uplifting part, which is people that are without leadership and without any forms of factions behind them or anything, are really talking to each other and being the Palestinian people overall.
Thank you, Ines. We're going to come back to talking about that piece. We want to hear more and unpack that more, of both leadership and Palestinian people across geographies and borders or would-be borders. But first, since you brought up what's happening inside of 48 and these protests, would anyone like to comment on that in particular? Netanyahu this morning vowed to restore order with an iron fist in Israeli cities where there have been protests and violence.
I think I can jump in.
Thanks.
I mean, there's been such a neglect of the Palestinian communities that are inside Israel, right? And there's been such a frustration among the Palestinians there with the lack of resources that have been put into the communities, the lack of budget that they experience because of the discriminatory ways in which Israel allocates its budgets. And, there's been a lot of concern about the rising violence within Palestinian communities, particularly the armed groups that have now taken over a lot of the Palestinian communities. So it is quite interesting to see now that finally you see the Israeli government having the time and interest to go to and attend to Palestinian communities, because they are now, those firearms are now being pointed at Israeli police. And these armed groups are now becoming activated and resisting the Israeli forces that are in the Palestinian communities. So this is an interesting development to me, but it's also really concerning because we know that Israel really doesn't distinguish between its own citizens. that are of Palestinian descent and those that are, whether in Gaza or in the occupied territories or Jerusalem. Palestinians are Palestinians to the Israeli government and its police units and its military. And so, when you're talking about a situation in which Palestinians are armed and so are the Israeli forces, I think we can expect to see the same disproportionate response that we see in other cases, like in particular in Gaza. So I think that's an especially worrying development to me. I mean, what's been really beautiful and amazing about the Jerusalem protests have been the way in which it's been largely nonviolent on the Palestinian side, and the way they've been spontaneous in bringing people together, whether in communal prayer to face off Israeli police, or just in the way the community was caring for each other, whether setting up Ramadan tables in the middle of a street as a buffer between Israeli settlers and Sheikh Jarrah or what have you. So I think this development inside of the Palestinian communities where there are these armed groups is going to take us to a different level that I think is really unfortunate, because I think the conversation is going to change a bit as it does when you start seeing Hamas rocket fire or Palestinians with weapons.
Thank you for that, Zaha. Nadia, you were nodding. If you want to jump in, feel free. You can unmute yourself, or we can wait.
Yeah, no, I thanks very much, Sarah, and it's really good to be here with my colleagues. Yeah, there has been amongst Palestinian activists and human rights advocates some criticism of Hamas for launching those attacks, and sort of sidelining the peaceful nature of what was going on in Gaza. But I was struck by the fact that there is a lot of fear that Israel may use as an excuse to whatever's going on to blow up the Dome of the Rock. Not Israel, but fanatic settlers, with Israel turning a blind eye. And on the Monday, if you remember, there was a huge push by the Israeli forces to get all the Palestinians out of the Haram al-Sharif area, and using a lot of tear gas and just physically pummeling people out. And then there was a fire and so on. So you just never knew, is this the moment that, oh, sorry, a mistake has happened? And it's been something that's been bubbling under the surface and keeps reemerging. And as I was looking back, the head of the Al-Qaf ministry responsible for Al-Aqsa had warned in January that of the tightening measures on Palestinians under the pretext of the coronavirus, and while at the same time facilitating the raids of settlers. So I think there's a real fear amongst a lot of Palestinians that maybe Al-Aqsa is in danger, as it has been on previous occasions when there was actually an attempt back in the 80s to blow it up.
Thank you for that. Thank you for adding that in. I want to, as we're digging in deeper, I want to actually talk about Jerusalem just a bit more, because the forced displacement of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah and the attacks on Al-Aqsa, and you were just talking about Monday, sparked this current onslaught, sparked where we are now. Can one of you bring context to these events, for our audience to understand that the current violence didn't just come out of nowhere, what it's relating to, particularly with Jerusalem? And there has been a lot of talk about the concept of the ongoing or the unending Nakba also.
I can jump in. You're really correct, Sarah Ann. I mean, for sure, the heavy-handed Israeli provocations in and around Al-Aqsa Mosque are key here. I mean, this is the month of Ramadan, a sacred time for Muslims and a place that is sacred to them. It also happens to be home to Palestinians in the city that is their capital. I mean, even among Christians, the provocations are meaningful for what it says about their own security in the city and their own holy places. But Sheikh Jarrah, you know, and the forced displacements really mobilized Palestinians everywhere. In Sheikh Jarrah, you have the entire Palestinian story, you know, narrated. You've got Palestinian refugees from 1948 reliving their forced displacement and trauma all over again. And because it's Ramadan and you have people out on the streets late in the night celebrating this time of year, and because this is Jerusalem, and you know, the provocations against the youth that we saw at Bab al-Amud, the Damascus Gate, and at the Haram al-Sharif, this was like the perfect storm to mobilize Palestinians everywhere to action. And there is no Palestinian family that doesn't know about the loss of home and the denial of their identity. This is a lived experience of, you know, even Palestinian citizens of Israel, so many of whom were internally displaced themselves in 1948 and lost their homes and property, even though they remained inside Israel and became citizens. So it's an ongoing experience for Palestinians facing down Israeli colonization in the West Bank as well. And, you know, there's more than 70% of the Palestinians in Gaza are refugees. So that this, you know, this confluence of it being Jerusalem, it being Ramadan, and that story of Sheikh Jarrah resonates with every single Palestinian, including those of us living outside, you know, in the diaspora. So, you know, it's that I think was different this time than in so many other times where we see, you know, these heavy-handed Israeli attacks against Palestinians that of course trouble us all and stir us all. But this moment, I think, was something very different.
Say more about what was different, Zaha, please.
You know, like I said, just because of, you know, there's been a lot of things that have happened in the last 4 years in particular, you know, with, you know, the Trump administration and the acceleration in, you know, Israeli actions to further, you know, colonize the West Bank, to further marginalize Palestinian identity and the Palestinian narrative and Palestinian claims to the land. You're seeing, especially in Jerusalem, acceleration in trying to drive out Palestinian communities and to carve up Jerusalem in a way that would, you know, leave the Jerusalemites outside. And of course, you're inside of Israel proper, 48 Palestine, as Palestinians will say. You know, you had the Jewish nation state law, you know, enshrined in you know, with constitutional authority that basically told Palestinian citizens that they aren't legitimate citizens of, or, you know, on the same par as Israeli Jewish citizens. And so all of that in the last 4 years has been visited upon Palestinians living in historic Palestine. And I think this moment, because of, you know, because it being Ramadan, because we're in Jerusalem, because we're talking about Sheikh Jarrah that encapsulates the entire Palestinian experience, like I said, it was the perfect storm for, you know, folks to become mobilized and impassioned around this idea of, you know, enough is enough.
Thank you. Thank you. Nadia, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just maybe to say, and maybe you wanted to touch on this perhaps a bit later, but for me, the outpouring of the Palestinian narrative has been really striking on this occasion. So many Palestinian stories have been told, they've been shared on Twitter, they've been shared across the world, and for a change, they've been given voice. So they're reaching new audiences and new media. And as we were saying, earlier, that the people of Sheikh Jarrah and the youth, especially the youth, are finding ways, very creative ways, I think, to get the stories out. So you have the existing storytellers across in Palestine and across the world about the Palestinian story, and you have a whole new wave of storytellers that are being heard to tell the Palestinian story. So I think that really has made a significant difference on this occasion.
Yes, I can come in here. On the last point you made, Nadia, it's very true. I think you know, sometimes we're discussing, you know, revolutions will not be televised, but revolution will happen on social media or not. It's clear that actually it's really helped just for Palestinians to tell what happens, because immediately if a soldier or a police is arresting them, if something happens, someone is either live on Instagram or you know, sharing on Twitter or on Facebook, and this is hugely important. And you might have followed that you know, Facebook and Instagram have actually massively censored content, and automatically, obviously, thousands of people also see that, right? So you could also see the reactions, and I think thanks also to a lot of great organizing from, you know, our colleagues in Palestinian civil society. Like, we work all together, and you know, some that have worked on also pushing back against that censorship, because it's such an important tool for Palestinians to be heard, and also to be heard as individuals and have their stories and their voice heard. Because if you see in the mainstream media, a lot of what's happening always is, you know, you see massive people, you see Palestinians throwing rocks again and kefiyas, and again, you have that very dehumanizing image that's portrayed to the world, right? The media are only watching when Palestinians are throwing stones, but not when they are telling their own story or having iftar together and sharing some memories or something. And I think that moment, I think, allowed that too, and social media allows that, and I think that's amazing. And another thing I wanted to say about Jerusalem is, you know, generally, I think everywhere Israel rules by fear, right? Israel is a colonial state. It's a repressive state. It's an occupying force, and basically, you know, 2 months ago, people were still asking us, oh, but so where, you know, has the Palestinian cause disappeared, and where is Palestine? Where are Palestinians? And nobody cares anymore, you know, and sorry, like, all these Arab states are you know, signing peace accords, normalizing with Israel. So, you know, where are you? What can you do? And I think what people don't realize is that the daily violence of it all is a constant boiling, you know, it's a boiling, I don't know how to say it in English, but it's really just a boiling thing all the time that's about to explode, because you're talking about people constantly, every day, intimidated, repressed, denied their identity, denied, you know, their collective identity. And to be honest, religion there, I think, plays a big role. I think it's wrong to say it's a religious conflict. It's wrong to say it's Jews versus Muslims, and, you know, we need to really push back against this. But clearly, when you have you know, a complete, like, people feel abandoned. Palestinians have felt abandoned, especially in Jerusalem, because there is no Palestinian leadership, and especially also in 48, because of the national project just transforming. And so people also turn to religion. In Jerusalem, religion plays a big role. People are religious. And I think this is also because it's a factor of identification, of identity, of you know, of making sure you can express your identity, because you're denied being Palestinian, you're denied being, you know, Arab and all this. There is no common family anymore, because you've been so much broken and fragmented. And so that also crystallizes, I think, a lot of, you know, when you touch Al-Aqsa and when you touch Haram al-Sharif, this just explodes. So, you know.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. So people have been saying lately that we've been seeing Palestinian youth so much at the forefront of all of this, both on social media and in person on the streets. And one of the things that I have heard is people saying that the youth have lost their fear, or they have no fear. Speaking to what you were just talking about, Ines. And so I want to, Nadia, you have spoken about, we've now talked about this almost spontaneous eruption, it looks like, of protest, of solidarity, of support. But Nadia, you've spoken in particular of the need for leadership. And Ines, you just spoke about the feeling of being abandoned for having no leadership. So let's talk about leadership. Who is leading now? What kind of leadership is it? What does this moment say about the Palestinian Authority? And we have a question from a listener asking also for us to comment, for you to comment about the role of the elections and the canceling of the elections and how this plays in at all also. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the canceling of the elections, I think, ramped up the frustration and the real frustration and anger that Ines was referring to. People just saw no way out. And what you may say that elections under occupation are not as meaningful as they could be, to put it mildly, because you really have no control whatsoever over your freedom of movement or your management of your budget or your resources or so on. But people just felt extremely frustrated because they've been stuck with this leadership for decades without any effectiveness. And I think the PLO was extremely effective in bringing the Palestinian people together after the loss of Palestine in the 60s and on, and putting Palestine and Palestinians on the world map and regrouping the Palestinian people so that we felt we were a people. But since then, and since the PLO actually lost, was kicked out of Beirut by the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, it kind of lost its way, and then it wanted to do anything to be able to go back to Palestine, but there it got trapped under the occupation, just like the rest of the Palestinians trapped under the occupation. And I think what's really tragic is that the leadership that we've had does not understand sources of power. The first Intifada was a huge source of power, a peaceful civil resistance movement that put Palestine on the map. It's easy to forget how impactful it was, how it broke through everything, how everyone saw Palestinians as real people with aspirations and hopes, and how creative it was. And it was a real source of power. And by the way, it had leadership. It had very strategic, good leadership, but underground leadership as it needs to be in a place of freedom, in a place, without freedom. It has to be an underground leadership. They did not capitalize on that. Instead, they went the Oslo route. If maybe one thing will come out of this whole mess that we're in at the moment, this whole disaster, it's maybe it'll finally drive a stake in the heart of negotiations, of bringing both sides back together to the negotiating table, which is still being asked for by Mahmoud Abbas and the PA, without any realization that you cannot rely on the US to support your position, or the Europeans. You have to have your own sources of power. Otherwise, at the negotiating table, you're completely wiped out. So I think what's happening here is that there is definitely a lack of national leadership, which is very much needed. And this is something that we as a group focused on. How can we find a way to rebuild national Palestinian leadership? And this is why we came up with the idea that we captured in our study on the relationship between the PLO and the diplomatic corps. the PLO diplomatic corps and the Palestinian diaspora. And we focused on that to see if it could be an entry point to rebuilding Palestinian leadership and bringing Palestinians back with leadership, holding it to account, having a say and a voice in how to move forward. And that report was released last week. And I think we're hoping it will make a contribution to the discussion about leadership and a possible entry point that I don't think anyone has focused on previously, where the PLO offices are one of the few points where the Palestinian diaspora can actually access the Palestinian national movement and make its voice heard. So that's one thing we've done, because without effective leadership, we can't take all this energy and make it meaningful and impact on the forces that are preventing us from realizing our rights, whether it's the Israeli forces, whether it's their American supporters or their European enablers. You know, we have to break through all of that. And without leadership, ultimately, I don't think we can do that. So this report is one small contribution to what an entry point back to leadership could look like.
Thank you. Thank you for that, and for the longer term view that you just offered us. And we look forward to having a conversation about the report and about your analysis and your recommendations at another moment. But here we are now, in the absence of the national leadership that you just spoke of. It seems that Hamas is taking advantage of that political space. And so I wanted to ask about how Hamas figures into this question of who speaks for Palestinians and what leadership looks like, the dynamic between, or the relationship between the PA and Hamas, and also how Palestinians are responding to Hamas's actions and choices right now. Ines, would you weigh in for us, please?
I think your analysis is correct. I think clearly so obviously, you know, just to go back a little, the elections were postponed, most probably because of the internal divisions within the Fatah movement, and they used Jerusalem as an excuse. You know, I think no one denies that obviously there cannot be elections without Jerusalem. No Palestinians would allow elections without Jerusalem. However, the leadership didn't fight at all. They basically capitulated. They just like gave in, you know, the Israel refusal, which we all know Israel will never officially agree for Palestinians to have elections in Jerusalem.
I'm going to interrupt you for one quick second. When you say the leadership didn't push back and just capitulated, do you mean the PA?
The PA, yeah. So let's say the Fatah dominated PA. Because eventually, I think the PA is composed today mainly, and the PLO leadership of mainly Fatah people who are loyal to the president, Mahmoud Abbas. And right now you could see with the popular movement that, again, that leadership was silent, absent, didn't do anything. They actually allowed demonstrations in Ramadan, they would only accept demonstrations related to Jerusalem. Because obviously you had the demonstrations that were linking the two, right? That it was also organized by some of the movements and the people who were going to go to the elections and organized, you know, to march in the street in solidarity with Jerusalem. The PA was, you know, afraid that there would be actually anti-PA demonstrations. Which there was probably a bit of that. And yesterday they blocked a march to, you know, on Jerusalem, just to make sure it didn't. So again, with that idea that there is security coordination with Israel that is very obvious and I think criticized by a lot of the Palestinians, who sees that the PA is effectively enforcing basically Israel's occupation instead of confronting it. And so in that space, obviously the boulevard is open for Hamas, who was not really interested either in elections, to be honest. They were also interested in just having this form of power sharing with Fatah, and kind of having these elections to consolidate a power sharing. But now with spontaneous, demonstrations happening and protests, it's in their advantage to hijack that too. And I think for the Palestinians, they eventually, most Palestinians, they support resistance against the occupation. And I think the conversation should not be about what choice of resistance that is, but rather what are the root causes of that resistance? Like, why are Palestinians feel the need to resist? And then, because if you just focus on, okay, so what are the tools? Like, oh, Hamas is doing this bad, or Fatah is doing this bad, and don't go that route. Palestinians will keep being patronized instead of actually, the international community and Israel being pressured to just simply end settler colonialism and occupation. And I think we're in that moment. And I think that the Palestinians, they're not naive, but they're clearly, again, these protests, they're not organized. They're organized by grassroots movements, by people who are, just, will it be hijacked by factions? Who knows? We don't know that yet. But it's clear that I think the absence of Palestinian leadership plays a big role. I would, however, just downplay the role that the elections cancellation played, because, for example, in Jerusalem, people couldn't care less about the elections, or at least they didn't feel concerned, because the PA hasn't been there forever. It has never been there. The PLO was there, but then, was repressed and had to go. And eventually they've been under Israeli control, under an Israeli municipality. They pay tax to Israel. They learn Hebrew in school, and they have to live under Israeli ruling effectively. And so for them, PA elections felt something that was not for them, that was not made for them. And so I think that is important, because I don't think that played a big role in them, uprising. And I'll end by actually, because you said like breaking the barrier of fear, that was how I wanted to conclude my earlier point, and I forgot. But indeed, I think what's so interesting is anywhere in the world, you can see when there is some form of uprising or revolutionary movement, it's because there is some form of the barrier of fear is falling. And again, the Israeli regime is made to make Palestinians be fearful all the time of, losing their residency, losing their home, being called to be an informant and having your social life ruined, or being killed, being put into prison. So all of this is, made to basically just break any form of uprising.
I just would add a footnote to what Ines said so beautifully. This whole idea that this could get away from the PA, these protests. Initially the Fatah-led PA was quite supportive of Palestinians going out and protesting. I mean, they were telling their Fatah cadres to go out and to protest on Jerusalem, and they allowed the protests to go forward, even though there would be engagement between the Israeli military and the protesters. And this is probably not only because we're talking about Jerusalem, but also because this Palestinian Authority has been very frustrated by the lukewarm response it's getting from the administration on the issues of peacemaking, and so this was an opportunity to assert some relevancy and to bump up Palestine on the U.S. agenda a bit more. But it definitely is concern, I think, among the PA about the things getting out of hand, and that's why yesterday it was interesting to listen to the press briefing in the State Department, because I think there was a little bit of a slip by spokesperson who let out that the U.S. asked Abu Mazen to clamp down on Eid celebrations, to cancel Eid celebrations, and he said okay. So, because we heard yesterday that Abu Mazen had announced that he was going to call off the Eid celebrations, but it was the context for that was that because of all of the the loss of life and the difficulties on the ground around the current violence, that was the reason for him wanting to cancel any kind of Eid celebrations. But then we heard yesterday now it was the U.S. asking him to do so. So I think that this is an issue that we're going to see moving forward, because I don't believe that there's going to be an end to the Gaza bombardment anytime soon. And the pressure is going to grow on the Palestinian Authority in terms of, where are they on all of this? Are they still trying to present themselves as the good peace partner for the U.S., or are they going to prioritize their own people and start thinking about strategies and ways in which they can empower their people and continue to resist Israeli colonization and oppression?
Thank you, Zaha. Thank you for all of that. We're going to come back to talking about strategies and potential strategies in a moment. I actually want to stick with you, Zaha, and ask you more about DC, since you brought up the State Department and pressure that they're putting on Mahmoud Abbas. Until the Damascus Gate protest, and even until more recently, I think yesterday there were I think I saw at least 5 different articles all saying that there's new pressure on Biden, because the Biden team was seeming to stay as far away as they could from Israel-Palestine and from engaging with Palestinians. Do you think that the Biden administration, do you think that they might change their approach now that it looks like this bombardment could continue? Do you think that they will engage in a different way?
I mean, definitely Israel-Palestine has a way of forcing itself on administrations that really would prefer perhaps not to have to deal with it. But, I just want to note that, this administration from the get-go has said, we are just so busy. We're just so busy with all the other things we have to do domestically, and, and we have other priorities in the Middle East. And for sure, the administration does. But what administration doesn't have 1,000,001 things to do? And to think that this administration, can't walk and chew gum at the same time is really, hard to fathom, especially since it's finding a lot of time to pursue Arab normalization with Israel. I mean, it's finding a lot of time to pursue increased security coordination and sharing of security and technology with Israel. It's finding a whole lot of time for all the myriad ways in which it supports and uplifts Israel, domestically as well as in the region. So to say that this administration just didn't have time and couldn't invest any more of its resources as it continues to supply $3.8 billion a year to Israel is really hard to believe. So I think a lot of this was really overplayed, by the administration, that, oh, we just don't have time, And so now, the issue is front and center, and it's front and center, obviously because we have this close relationship with Israel and we care about what happens to Israel. But it's also front and center because this administration in particular has said that values is a centerpiece of its foreign policy. And it's said that it wants to reassert itself as a global leader and, restore respect for multilateral institutions and the legal order. And this challenge of Palestine is going to hamper all those efforts because, there is no starker example of the complete disregard of international law and international institutions than Palestine. And there's no starker example of U.S. hypocrisy in this regard than Palestine. So I think that this is going to be a real difficult one for the administration to ignore. It's going to have to bump up on their priority level. But I think what we're going to end up seeing is you're going to end up seeing an administration that's doing a lot of behind the scenes with Israel. And I think that's happening right now. We're not seeing sort of the full blown, takedown of Israeli leaders because, the US does want to engage on Iran, doesn't want to pick a fight with Israel publicly on this particular issue at this critical moment when they're working on the Iran front. So you're gonna see them doing this very quietly behind the scenes. Similarly with the Palestinians, there's going to be a lot of behind the scenes, be good, do this, do that, don't make too many waves, and that's going to be what takes place on the leadership level. But that's not going to necessarily have an impact on what's going on with Palestinians on the ground. I think the situation inside Israel, the situation in the occupied territories, and in particular in Gaza, are going to not make it so easy for the U.S. to do this sort of quiet diplomacy that they would like to in order to not have to engage more fully.
Thank you. Yeah, Ines.
Yeah, I wanted to add, and I saw a question also in the Q&A. I think what's remarkable is the evolution that we're seeing. And sometimes I don't know if it's because I'm in the media space now and I wasn't maybe a few years back, but clearly I think what's most important these days is the change in narrative. I think the most important change we need to push for is clearly for the international community, and that starts, in the narrative, in the discourse, really reconnecting the way they analyze the situation with what's going on the ground in the reality. And I think right now what we see is still, this idea, this narrative around this is a both sides issue, and there is two parties, and this is a conflict between two parties that should just, go around the table and negotiate and basically arrange, different interests they have. And that is so completely, obviously, disconnected from the reality. And I think this is changing because obviously when you have Human Rights Watch, saying that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid, when you have so many Palestinians going on social media and showing, when you have cases like Shasharah of obvious dispossession and illegal displacement being on the forefront and showcasing, being a symbol of all the dispossession that has been happening. When you also see the Palestinian people coming together, suddenly it's not West Bank Gaza, it's actually Palestinian people are also all across historic Palestine. And I think breaking those lines and kind of getting really that this is a settler colonial problem. And this is what we eventually need to resolve, including the right of return, right? That had also disappeared completely from the narrative. All of this, I think, is slowly happening. And so I think there is a silver lining there. I'm not saying it's mainstream, it's clearly not. But when you see Congress people, when you see celebrities, influencers, when you see, in the Democratic Party, people pushing also the Biden administration to, push in that direction, it makes it more and more difficult to ignore the reality. And I think this is what we need to push for, because until we're talking about the peace process and negotiations and both sides' responsibilities, we're not move forward. This will only embolden Israel's impunity, and it will just only allow them to continue what they've been doing and how they've been basically maintaining this, this low intensity violence and this dispossession all across Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, and inside Israel. And so I think this is really a key, and I'm fairly optimistic, let's say, in some ways, that we can continue pushing in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So will you talk to us about what that pushing can look like? Like the shifting of this narrative, what would it look like to internationalize this cause of the global movement for Palestinian rights, to have an international strategy?
Well, I mean, as we discussed before, I think until until the PA and the PLO don't change strategies, I think we'll somehow eventually, you know, hit a wall at some point. I think what clearly is needed, because obviously the international community is really important, and I think continue to, you know, ask for ending military funding to Israel and you know, condition any aid or cooperation in changing the relationship with Israel is so important. Also to allow Palestinian society to renew its political leadership. I think that, you know, this is not disconnected. However, clearly, I think as we Palestinians see that the utmost priority right now is also to renew our national movement. And I think we don't even know what that means. Some people, you can see actually everyone now really coming together and seeing the protests and the uprisings. But in all those people, you don't have, you know, you have thousands of different opinions. You had some people want one state, some people want two states, some people, they want the renewal of the PLO, some people want something else than the PLO. I don't think people know. I just think that that needs to happen. That needs to be a renewal in leadership, and clearly everyone feels that the Oslo regime and of the everything around the Middle East peace process is dead. It's to be put behind, and I think that's a consensus that clearly the leadership, the current leadership, is not ready to take. And as you said, and I think this is very key. And the internationalization is clearly has been shaping over the past years and will continue to do so in the contemporary world we live in. People, they are uprising against autocratic states, against cyber surveillance, against you know, militarized states, against ethno-nationalism and racism. And I think obviously we want to re-universalize also what's going on in Palestine, or de-exceptionalize Israel, I think is another way of saying it, because that's really just, it's beyond just Israel Palestine. Like what we're seeing here is you know, are you pro justice and freedom and equality? And I think this resonates, and I think it's obviously different from what the PLO had been fighting around in, you know, in a world where decolonial movements were really powerful and shaping, and this was, you know, allies that they have. And today we're here and we're still in this colonial reality, but the world has changed, and the you know, the solidarity, and I think what resonates with people and the struggles have evolved. And I think this is where, you know, Palestine is, I think, creating its international solidarity with.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Nadia, will you weigh in, please?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to say that for me, the biggest danger is that the US could try to intervene or try to do something, because I don't think they have any creative ideas. It's probably more important for them to put pressure on Israel behind the scenes than to try and move forward any kind of negotiations or peace deal or whatever, because we'll just find ourselves going back to square one, where here's these both sides and they have to make concessions, and the Palestinians have you know, bent over backwards to make any number of concessions, and all that's happened. Israel has swallowed up more and more territory and got stronger and stronger. And so I think we have some time to go before, and also I don't think we can get rid of the Oslo framework so easily and quickly, because a lot of people depend on it for their livelihoods. And so that's a real fear. So of course, Palestinian youth and activists and so on are pushing to change that. But the reality is that people still need to live. People still need to survive. You still need UNRWA. You still need tragically, you still need, you know, the Oslo, that piece of the Oslo Accords that will allow money to reach people and have that kind of quasi government. But what I think we will have, what we will see coming out of this, is something that's happened every single time Israel has attacked Gaza. And I say Israel has attacked Gaza because it's its firepower is so much greater than anything Gaza or Hamas could do, and it just pulverizes the people in the countries, and the disproportionate level of firepower, I think, is extremely visible to people around the world. And so every time Israel has, there's been an outbreak between Israel and Gaza, that's grown the movement for Palestinian rights exponentially. So after each assault on Gaza, the movement for Palestinian rights has grown hugely. And now you have a very strong movement for Palestinian rights across the world, including among Jews, and especially amongst American Jews. And for me, I hold a lot of hope for the growth of understanding and power of American Jews getting behind a human rights framework, and pushing for an end to apartheid and equal rights. And I think that's happening very quickly now. The discourse is shifting very, very rapidly. You look how long it took to get the word apartheid in the discourse from having a few activists say so about 20, 25 years ago, to it growing slowly, but extremely slowly. And then suddenly in the space of 4 years, you have 3 or 4 major reports, topped by the Human Rights Watch report, really describing this extremely clearly and categorically as a situation of apartheid. And I think that's having a big impact on the movement for Palestinian rights, and giving clarity for the direction and how to move forward. So, and maybe putting an end to that sterile debate of whether it should be 1 state or 2 states, and focusing on I think the rights for all. So I think this is the time when we will see the global movement for Palestinian rights really grow in strength. You have something like 50 groups in the US all coming together now to push Congress, to push the administration to take action. It's really quite an impressive and growing movement. And some of this is even happening in Europe, and even here in Britain, where it's extremely stifled, you can see things getting organized, and including young British Jews getting organized.
Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify just a point, because I think when I say getting rid of Oslo, it doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of the PA or destructing the PA, because I totally agree with you, Nadia, that I think this is unrealistic, and I don't think that's what people want. But I think getting rid of Oslo means getting rid of the framing around the peace process and the dynamics of dependency, all these mechanisms and these things that are actually making the PA so dependent on Israel, and every single step that they need to do is with the accord of the agreement of Israel. And so I think we should rethink just what is our self-government. If it's the PA has obviously its infrastructure, its structure, and a lot of people depend on its services. I don't think that includes UNRWA, because UNRWA was living much before Oslo. But the PA, I think we need to rethink what that self-government is for and is about, because again, it doesn't represent Palestinians for a political solution, but it does provide services. But it does provide services within a framework that is making them completely dependent on just Israel decision-making on everything. And so, we could keep a form of self-government administration, call it the PA, but in a different, I think, paradigm. I think that's more what I meant.
Thank you for that clarification. And this is a reminder that we're going to have you back to have a longer, deeper discussion about the PA and the PLO and future possibilities based on the research that you did. And I really look forward to that discussion when the time is right. But here we are now in these days of immense violence, and we're coming up on the hour. And I know that you are each so busy and fully engaged with what is happening now. And so I don't want to take too much more of your time. I want to ask you, please, to close us out. Tell our audience, what do you want to ask of our audience? What are the most important things that people can do from afar at this moment? We always always get asked that question every time we have guests, and now more urgently than ever. So please, if you would each answer that question. Zaha, let's start with you.
You know, I feel like there's so much to capture the imagination of Americans right now. There's so much going on. There's, you know, of course, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of trying to begin to think about a recovery from all of the economic challenges that Americans have faced. And there's all these other global issues, right, that are of concern to Americans. So I think it's really hard to talk about Palestine, knowing that there are all of these other you know, ways in which Americans are pulled. But I think in the case of Palestine, the thing I would ask people is, you know, because we are so implicated in everything that's happening there, whether it's the weapons that are being used, whether it's the way it impacts us domestically in terms of what kinds of civil liberties we can expect to have as Americans when Israel is the topic of conversation. Whether it's the way, you know, social media platforms try to censor and control the debate and discussion, I would just ask people to really take the time to educate yourselves. And I mean, you're here listening to us, so obviously I'm talking to believers here, but I mean, it's really difficult to get good and accurate information if you rely on mainstream, you know, cable news networks or those kinds of things. So I would really encourage that, and share with friends, really share with your friends what you're learning.
Thank you, Zaha. Nadia?
Yeah, I would say there's a strong civil society movement in the US and overseas that is really pushing for Palestinian rights. So please support it in every way you can, amplify its voices. These organizations need funding. So I would urge that you support and fund that. And then front and center Palestinian voices. And as Zaha said, push for them to get heard in the media. Don't let them get away with silencing Palestinian voices. They've broken through now because of what's going on the ground, and that will always happen, but then they get silenced again. So I would ask that, you know, please stop from our being silenced.
Thank you, Nadia. Yes, Ines, please.
Fully agree on that. And so my only additional point will be, please do organize to vote and elect progressive people, or people who believe in justice and values of justice, freedom, rights, domestically and abroad. So, you know, I think when you're a coherent politician, you do believe in I think, a medical, you know, health, right to health for all, but also, you know, not to fund the Israeli military or any human rights abusers. So definitely that's so important, because we've seen also how that has made evolve US policies. Yeah, and for sure what Zaha and Nadia said as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the three of you, Zaha, Nadia, and Ines, so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this event, to listen to this event. We are so glad to share this conversation with you. Please check back at the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for the recording of this conversation, for a list of resources relating to the conversation, and for announcements of upcoming events, webinars, and podcasts. Thank you all so much. Until next time, thank you.